The night her father told her she was to be sold, Valentina Greco was standing barefoot on cold marble, a glass of Barolo in her hand and blood on her conscience. Not her own blood. That was the problem. She had just come from the hospital. St. Cecilia's on the Upper East Side, the kind of hospital that charged enough per night that the patients in it could afford to buy silence. She'd been visiting Marco Chetta, her father's most loyal capo, who had taken 3 bullets meant for Carmine Greco during a botched exchange near the Brooklyn docks. Marco would live. The men who'd shot him would not. That part had already been handled, swiftly and without ceremony. In the way her family handled most things, she'd washed her hands in the hospital bathroom. Twice. But she could still feel the phantom warmth of Marco's blood on her palms where she'd pressed down on his wounds while waiting for the ambulance that could never be called, the paramedics who could never know. She'd learned to apply pressure at 14. She'd learned not to flinch at 20. She was 26 now, and she was very good at not flinching. Valentina. Her father's voice came from the study, that dark, book-lined room that smelled of cigar smoke and old leather, and the particular cologne he'd worn her entire life. She had always associated that smell with safety. Tonight it made her stomach turn. "Come in and close the door." She did both. Carmine Greco was 62 years old and looked 50. He was a barrel-chested man, with silver hair swept back from a face that was all hard angles and deeper-set eyes, the kind of eyes that could convey warmth and threat in the same glance. He ran the Greco crime family with an iron discipline that had kept them the dominant power in New York for 15 years. He was ruthless, brilliant, and deeply, genuinely loved by the men who served him. He was also her father, which meant she knew all of this and still inexplicably loved him back. He was sitting behind his desk. Beside him, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, was her uncle Aldo. That detail, Aldo's presence, sent a cold thread of dread down her spine. Aldo only stood like that when things were formal, when decisions had been made without her. "Sit down, sweetheart," her father said. "I'd rather stand." He didn't argue. He never argued with her about small things, which was how she'd always known when something large was coming. He picked up his cigar, took a long pull, and let the smoke drift toward the coffered ceiling. "You know the situation with the Vitales," he said. "I know there's been a war coming for 2 years," she said. "I know Sal Vitale lost 2 men in Queens last month, and your men lost 1. I know the docks are bleeding money because no one will go near them after dark. I know the Italians are laughing at us both." Her father smiled, a thin, careful expression. "You pay attention. You raised me to." "I did." He set down the cigar. "Which is why I know you understand what it means when I tell you this needs to end. The Vitales are not going away. Neither are we. Blood won't solve it. Everybody we drop costs us 10 in revenue, in loyalty, in favors. The feds are watching. The city is watching. We need peace." "Then make peace," she said. "Sit down with Sal Vitale. Divide the territory. It's been done before." "Sal Vitale doesn't trust paper," Aldo said from the corner. His voice was careful, diplomatic. He had always been the mediator of the family, the man who translated her father's violence into reasonable-sounding language. "He doesn't trust agreements. He doesn't trust handshakes." What does he trust? Silence. Just a beat, but long enough. She felt it land before her father said the words. She felt it the way you feel a storm before you see the lightning, a pressure in the chest, a wrongness in the air. He trusts blood, her father said. A union between the families. The wine glass in Valentina's hand was very fine crystal. She was aware, distantly, that if she held it any tighter, it would shatter. She set it down on the edge of the desk with exaggerated care. "No," she said. "Valentina, no. Whatever you're about to say, the answer is no. I am not a commodity. I am not territory. I am not a treaty written in a church with someone else's last name. His name is Luca Vitale." Her uncle said it gently, as though the name were a gift. "Sal's eldest son. He's 34. He runs the family's operations in Manhattan and Chicago. He is, by every account, an exceptionally capable man. I don't care if he's the second coming of Christ, Aldo. He's a Vitale." "You're a Greco," her father said quietly. "You've always known what that means." She looked at him across the desk. This man who had taught her to read financial statements at 10 and the names of every senator in his pocket at 12. Who had held her when her mother died of cancer, when Valentina was 17, who had wept in front of her, the only time she'd ever seen him cry, and then straightened up and said, "We carry on. That's what we do." He had given her everything and shielded her from nothing. She loved him and she hated him, and right now she was struggling to separate the two. "I won't do it," she said. "You will," he said, not unkindly, simply the way he said everything that was already decided. "Not because I'm ordering you, Valentina, because you understand what happens if we go to war, not just to us, to every man who works for us, to their families, to Marco Cetta, who is lying in a hospital bed right now because of this. You understand blood. I made sure of it." She stood very still. Outside the window, Manhattan glittered in all its indifferent, gorgeous cruelty. 30 stories down, people were living lives that had nothing to do with crime families or arranged marriages or the specific horror of being a woman with no good choices. "Tell me about him," she said finally. Not agreement, not surrender, just the next breath she had to take. Her father reached into his desk drawer and set a photograph on the surface between them. Luca Vitale. Dark hair, dark eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from something expensive and unforgiving. He was standing at the edge of what looked like a rooftop in a charcoal suit, looking at something off camera, completely unaware he was being photographed. There was something about his expression, not cold exactly, but sealed, like a door that had been locked so long it no longer remembered being open. She looked at the photograph for a long time. "He doesn't know yet," her father said. "The meeting is Friday." "He doesn't know?" Something sharp and almost satisfying flickered through her. "So I'm not the only one being volunteered. Sal runs his family differently than I run mine." A diplomatic answer. She picked up her wine and walked to the window, pressing her free hand against the cold glass. "I want conditions," she said. "If this happens, I have conditions." Her father let out a slow breath. She could hear the relief in it, even now, and it made her feel sick. "Of course." She stared at her own reflection in the dark glass, dark hair, dark eyes inherited from her father's side, A mouth she'd been told all her life was too stubborn. Cheekbones she'd been told were beautiful. She looked at herself and thought, "This is the last night you are only yours." "I keep my own accounts," she said. "I keep my apartment. I keep my work with the foundation." She ran the Greco Family Foundation, a non-profit that funded arts education in underprivileged neighborhoods. It was real work, work she'd built herself, work that had nothing to do with crime. "And I want a year, 1 year to make this work before it's made permanent. If it's a disaster, there's an exit." Arranged marriages don't typically come with exits, Valentina. Mine does, or it doesn't happen. She turned from the window. "Those are my terms." Her father looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. She left the study without finishing her wine. In the elevator down to the parking garage, she pressed her back against the mirrored wall and let herself shake. Just for 30 seconds. Just long enough to feel it. Then she straightened, stepped out into the cold underground and got into the back of her car. "Home," she told her driver. She stared at the back of his headrest the entire ride and did not think about dark eyes or sealed doors or the particular weight of a last name she hadn't yet agreed to carry. She thought instead about a photograph. About a man standing on a rooftop, looking at something only he could see. She wondered what he was looking at. She wondered if he was the kind of man who would tell her, or the kind who would rather keep it a wound. The city blurred past the windows, all light and rush and beautiful indifferent noise. She was not ready. She went home anyway. Luca Vitali had been awake since 4 in the morning, which was not unusual. Sleep was something that happened to other people, people who had not spent the last decade building an empire on a foundation of controlled violence and strategic restraint. He slept in 4-hour increments when circumstances allowed, and circumstances rarely allowed. He was in his home office on the 53rd floor of the Vitale Tower on 5th Avenue when his father called. The office was all clean lines and dark wood, a room that looked like someone had taken a traditional space and stripped it of every unnecessary warmth. No photographs on the walls, no personal touches, nothing that could be used as leverage or read as softness. There was a single window behind his desk that framed the park, and in the blue-grey light of early morning, Central Park looked like something out of a painting by someone who only painted loneliness. "You need to come to dinner," his father said. No greeting, no preamble. Salvatore Vitali communicated in the same way he did everything, with the economy of a man who had never doubted for a moment that the world would rearrange itself around his preferences. "I have a meeting with the Chicago partners tonight. Reschedule it." "The Chicago partners don't reschedule, Pop." "Then send Nico." A pause. "This is important, Luca." His older brother, Nico, ran the family's security operations. The Chicago partners, a loose affiliation of Midwestern distributors, considered Luca to be their primary contact, which meant that sending Nico was technically possible and diplomatically inadvisable. His father knew this, which meant this dinner was more important than the Chicago partners. 7 o'clock, Luca said. 6. And wear something appropriate. I'm not sure what that means. It means not that thing you wore to Marco Abate's wake. You looked like a man going to a board meeting. I was going to a board meeting afterward. 6 o'clock, Luca. He arrived at the family compound in Oyster Bay, a sprawling colonial on 3 acres that his father had purchased in the 90s and which had been, at various points in Luca's memory, a fortress, a prison, a home, and a battlefield, at exactly 6 o'clock, which he knew from long experience was how you arrived when your father said 6. Not at 6:15, not at 5:50, out of eagerness, at 6. He parked himself, which he rarely did, and walked up the drive in the cooling evening air. The gardens on either side were manicured to a precision that his mother had established before she died, and that the groundskeepers maintained with a fidelity bordering on religious. She had loved this garden. She had died in it, technically, sitting in the chairs on the south lawn on a Tuesday afternoon in June, her heart stopping mid-conversation so quietly that the woman she'd been talking to thought she'd simply fallen asleep. Luca did not think about his mother if he could help it. He was very good at not thinking about things. His father was in the dining room with two men Luca didn't recognize. That was the first sign that this was not a family dinner. The second sign was the woman standing by the window. She had her back to the room, looking out at the darkening garden with the particular stillness of someone who was very deliberately not letting anything show. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress, something simple, expensive, with lines that fell from shoulder to floor without trying too hard, and her dark hair was swept back. From behind, she could have been any woman. Something about the line of her spine, the precise way she held her shoulders, suggested she was not. His father rose. "Luca, come in." He did. He scanned the room in the automatic way he'd trained himself to scan rooms, exits, threat vectors, the disposition of unknown bodies, and catalogued two men, both in suits, both relaxed but watchful. The kind of relaxed that was its own form of readiness. One older, silver-haired, powerful in the way that authority settles into men over decades. The other, the one standing slightly back, was more of an Aldo Greco type. Luca had done his research. He knew the Greco family well enough to make them. Carmine Greco and his brother Aldo. He understood then, before anyone said anything, what kind of dinner this was. He turned his eyes to the woman at the window. She turned as his gaze reached her, as though she'd felt it. He had that effect on people sometimes, a quality of attention that was almost physical in its weight. Most people reacted to it with discomfort. She met it straight on, and he found himself recalibrating. Valentina Greco was nothing like he'd expected. He'd been told about her, of course, brief intelligence from his family's channels. Greco's daughter runs a foundation, educated at Columbia, sharp, not involved in operations. The photograph he'd seen was from a charity gala 3 years prior, a formal image of a woman smiling at a camera, in the way you smiled at cameras when you knew you were being recorded. It had told him almost nothing. This told him more. She was beautiful in a way that was entirely inconvenient. Not delicate, not soft, but vivid. Everything about her face was precise and unsparing, the kind of beauty that didn't ask permission, and wasn't particularly interested in whether you appreciated it. Her eyes were dark and direct and already, even in this first moment, faintly hostile. Not at him specifically. He understood instinctively that the hostility was contextual. She was hostile at the situation. He couldn't blame her. "Luca," his father said, "this is Carmine Greco, his brother Aldo, and his daughter Valentina." Luca shook hands with Carmine first. The grip was firm and measured. the handshake of a man who had given many handshakes and understood exactly what was being communicated in each one. Luca matched it precisely. Then Aldo, who shook with more warmth, a practiced diplomat's grip. Then he turned to Valentina. She extended her hand. He took it. Her handshake was nothing like her father's. It was direct and slightly too firm, the handshake of someone who had decided to meet everything with her chin up. "Mr. Vitali," she said. Her voice was low and controlled, with a faint rasp that he found startling. He had not expected her voice to be that way. He had not expected to notice. "Ms. Greco," he said. He released her hand. They sat down to dinner, which was elaborate and formal, and, Luca thought, almost comic in its staging. His father's housekeeper had set the table with the best china, the good crystal, candlelight, a performance of normalcy draped over an extraordinary transaction. He ate without tasting anything, listening to his father and Carmine Greco discuss the proposal with the particular combination of ceremony and bluntness that characterized men of their generation. They spoke about it as though it were a merger, as though the two people sitting across the table from each other were line items in a contract. Luca watched Valentina through the course of it. She ate. She answered questions when addressed. She was polite without being warm and precise without being cold. She gave nothing away, which he recognized as a specific kind of skill, and he wondered when she'd learned it. When the proposal had been laid out in its full detail, the marriage, the territories, the peace dividend, the timeline, Carmine looked at Valentina and said, "Valentina has some conditions." His father looked at Luca with an expression that was half apology. "She keeps her accounts," Carmine said. "Her foundation work, her apartment, for now, and a year. They get a year before it becomes permanent." Luca looked at Valentina. She was looking at her wine. "A year," he said. It wasn't a question. He was testing the sound of it. "A year," she confirmed, looking up at him. Her eyes were very steady. "To determine whether this is workable." He considered this. Around the table, everyone else seemed to hold their breath. "Reasonable?" he said. She looked faintly surprised that he'd agreed. He filed that away. She'd expected him to fight her on it. She thought him more rigid than he was. Or she had expected someone who needed to win small battles. He had no interest in small battles. Dinner continued, wine was poured, dessert was served. His father and Carmine discussed a date, 3 months hence, a small ceremony, nothing elaborate, the optics of discretion rather than spectacle. His father laughed at something Aldo said. The room felt almost absurdly festive. He watched Valentina set down her spoon and press her fingertips briefly to her temple, a gesture so small and so quickly suppressed that probably no one else at the table caught it. He caught it. He thought, "She has a headache. She is sitting here having a headache and doing it perfectly quietly so that no one can use it." He thought, "I know that particular discipline." He thought, "This is going to be complicated." After dinner, walking out through the foyer while their fathers completed some formality in the study, they found themselves briefly alone in the entrance hall. It was an accident of timing, nothing orchestrated. She was waiting for someone to fetch her coat. He had no need of a coat and had stopped for no reason he could immediately identify. She looked at him directly. He looked back. "I want you to know," she said, quietly enough that it wouldn't carry, "that I understand the necessity of this. I'm not going to make it difficult. I didn't assume you would. I also want you to know, she continued, as though he hadn't spoken, that I have conditions of my own beyond what my father mentioned, things I'll want to discuss before we formalize anything. All right. You're not going to ask what they are? Not in your father's foyer, he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly. More like a recalibration, the way someone looks when they get information that slightly adjusts their model of a situation. Fair enough, she said. Her coat arrived. She put it on without needing help, in the efficient way she seemed to do everything, and walked out into the cool night without looking back. He stood in the foyer for a moment after the door closed. His father appeared at his shoulder. Well, she's smart, Luca said. Good. You need smart. I don't need anything. His father put a hand on his shoulder, brief, firm. Everyone needs something, Luca. The ones who say they don't are usually the most desperate. He squeezed once and walked away. Luca stood in the empty foyer and looked at the door she'd walked through. He thought about the line of her spine, the steadiness of her eyes, the headache she'd hidden. He walked to his car and drove back to the city through the dark, and if his mind returned, more than once, more than was useful, to a woman in a burgundy dress standing at a window, with her back to a room she'd been sold into, he kept that detail in the compartment where he kept things he couldn't use. He was very good at compartments. It was one of the things that had kept him alive. She chose the restaurant. This was a deliberate act. She knew he would understand it as such, and she chose it anyway. A small, exceptional French bistro in the West Village, where the proprietor knew her by name, and the corner table by the window was available to her on a day's notice because she had been coming here for 4 years, and because the Greco name still meant something, even in restaurants that didn't advertise their loyalties. She arrived first. This too was deliberate. She was already seated when he walked in, 8 minutes after the reservation time, which told her either that he'd been held up or that he was testing the waters of her patience. She clocked him from the moment he appeared in the doorway. That contained, calibrated way he moved through public spaces, scanning without seeming to scan. A man who occupied his own coordinates with complete authority. He was wearing a dark navy suit tonight, no tie, the first button of his shirt open, different from the formal armor of the dinner at Oyster Bay. She noted it, filed it. He saw her cross the room and sat down without the ceremony of a greeting. She found this oddly refreshing. She had been greeted with too many elaborate pleasantries in her life by men who meant none of them. You chose well, he said, picking up the menu. I've been here before. I know, I checked. She met his eyes when he looked up. It seemed worth knowing if there was a history. And is there? A business dinner in 2021. Nothing personal. He set the menu down. You did surveillance on a restaurant. I did research on a man I'm being asked to marry. The restaurant was incidental. Fair. He looked at her without the studied blankness he'd worn at his father's table. There was something more present in him tonight, something she found harder to hold at a comfortable distance. What are your conditions, Ms. Greco? Valentina, she said. If we're going to do this, we can at least use first names. Valentina. She heard her name in his voice and had the strange, involuntary sensation of it landing somewhere it shouldn't. She moved past it. The foundation first, she said. The Greco family foundation operates independently. You and your family will have no involvement, no oversight, no access to its accounts or donor lists. It is entirely separate from everything else. Agreed. She'd expected some resistance, or at least a question. His agreement without negotiation was disorienting. She continued, I will not act as a social asset. I won't attend events specifically to perform the role of your wife for professional or political purposes without prior discussion and agreement. He tilted his head slightly. Define prior discussion. Meaning, you ask me. You tell me what you need, why, and you give me enough time to prepare. You don't simply announce that we're attending something. Also agreed. He paused. Though I'll note that I'm not particularly fond of social performance either, so there's likely to be less of it than you expect. She studied him. What do you actually want from this? It was a blunter question than she'd intended to ask tonight, and she saw the slight sharpening of his focus that told her it surprised him. Peace, he said. What my father said at dinner. We've lost money, men, and time to this conflict with your family for 2 years. I want it over. And the marriage is the price of that. For you as well as me, she said. It was important to say it. For me as well as you, he confirmed without any particular expression. She couldn't tell if it cost him anything. She couldn't tell much about him yet, and that in itself was a kind of information. He was extraordinarily controlled, and extraordinarily controlled men were either deeply dangerous or deeply damaged, and in her experience the Venn diagram was nearly a perfect circle. The waiter came. They ordered, she the duck, he the sole, both of them choosing wine with the quick decisiveness of people who had learned a long time ago not to waste time on small decisions. Tell me about the foundation, he said, when the waiter left. She looked at him. Why? Because you care about it more than anything else you've mentioned, and I prefer to understand the things that matter to the people I deal with. The phrasing, the people I deal with, was deliberately impersonal. She noticed it. It funds arts education programs, she said. 7 schools in the Bronx, Harlem, East New York, after-school music, visual arts, dance programs. We partner with 3 conservatories and keep costs at 0 for participating students. She paused. I started it because my mother played piano, because she always said she would have done something with it, but there were no opportunities where she grew up. I started it because the money we have came from enough ugly things that I wanted at least part of it to do something real. He was quiet. She felt she'd said more than she'd meant to, and felt a flicker of irritation at herself. That's a good answer, he said. It wasn't an answer. It was the truth. They're usually the same thing in my experience. He turned his wine glass slowly in his fingers, a slight, unhurried gesture. I have one condition of my own. Go ahead. Honesty, he said. I don't need warmth. I don't need performance. I need to be able to trust what you tell me. If something is wrong, I want to know. If you need something, I want to know. The same goes the other direction. I won't lie to you about anything relevant to your safety or your life. She considered this. It was a stranger condition than she'd anticipated, more intimate somehow than anything practical. Honesty, she said. It's the only thing I actually require. That's a very particular priority for a man in your line of work. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the negative space where amusement lived. I'm surrounded by deception professionally. I prefer not to replicate it at home. She thought about that through dinner. They talked more than she'd expected, and more easily than she'd feared. He asked about the foundation with what seemed like genuine curiosity, and she found herself explaining a grant process she was currently restructuring with a level of technical detail that she usually reserved for board meetings because he asked the right follow-up questions. He knew enough about non-profit finance to be interesting. She didn't ask him about his work. Not tonight. There were things she could ask, things that would get clinical answers. There were things she couldn't ask, things that had answers she didn't want to hear stated plainly. She was choosing her order of exposure. What she did ask at the end of dinner, over the espresso she needed and he didn't touch, "Are you seeing anyone?" The question was practical. She framed it as practical. He looked at her. "No." "Were you recently?" "That's two questions." "Yes," she said. "Were you recently?" The pause was just long enough. "There was someone," he said. "It ended 8 months ago. It ended because of the situation with your family. Specifically because I couldn't," he stopped, "because it wasn't safe for her." She absorbed this. The information was revealing in at least two ways: that he had been capable of something personal, and that he had been capable of ending it to protect someone. Neither of those things lined up with the coldness she'd been preparing herself for. "I'm not asking for the complete history," she said. "I just needed to know the current landscape." "Understood." He looked at her. "And you?" "I was seeing someone." She kept her voice level. "He decided the complications of my family name were more than he'd signed up for about a year ago." "His loss," Luca said. She looked at him sharply. He looked back, expressionless, as though he'd said nothing remarkable. She paid for dinner. He didn't argue, which impressed her and also slightly annoyed her, because she'd been prepared to argue. Outside on the sidewalk, in the cool October air, with the West Village doing its atmospheric best around them, cobblestones, yellow windows, the smell of rain on old stone, she turned to him. 3 months, she said. That's the timeline they've given us. Yes, we should probably see each other again before then. Probably, he agreed. They stood there for a moment in the particular suspended stillness of two people who don't know yet what they are to each other. A cab went past. Someone laughed somewhere in the middle distance. The night was cold enough that she could see her own breath. "I'll call you," she said. "All right." He put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at her, and there was something in that look, something direct and serious and slightly too long to be casual, that she felt in her sternum. She walked away first. She kept walking, unhurried, until she turned the corner and was out of sight. Then she stopped for one breath in the dark and put her hand flat against the nearest wall, as though she needed the solidity of it. She stood there. She thought about the ghost of a smile she'd seen on his face when she pushed back at something. She thought about the way he'd said his loss without the slightest trace of calculation. She thought, this is already more complicated than it was supposed to be. Then she hailed a cab and went home and did not think about it anymore, which was an absolute lie, but it was the kind of lie she was good at telling herself. The Vitale Club was not called the Vitale Club. It was called Obsidian, and it occupied the basement and first 3 floors of a building on West 26th Street that looked from the outside like any other converted warehouse in the Flatiron district. Inside it was something else entirely. Luca had designed it himself, or rather, he had sat with an architect for 14 hours over 2 weeks and produced something that looked the way he felt on his best nights: controlled, expensive, dark, and alive. The VIP section on the third floor had a view through smoked glass down to the main floor below, which made it excellent for watching without being watched. The private rooms in the basement were soundproofed and equipped with communications equipment that could transmit securely to 3 continents. The bar served the best Japanese whiskey in the city. The security team could have run a small military operation, which was not irrelevant. He was at the third-floor bar on a Thursday night, 2 weeks after the dinner with the Grecos, working through a Yamazaki 18 and a half of a security briefing from his head of operations, when his brother Nico dropped into the seat next to him and said, "So what's she like?" "What did father tell you?" "That you agreed without making a scene, which apparently set some kind of record." Nico signaled the bartender. He was 3 years older than Luca and looked nothing like him. Fair where Luca was dark, openly warm where Luca was sealed. The kind of man who walked into rooms and made friends without appearing to try. He was also, when the situation required it, the most dangerous man Luca knew. They'd grown up understanding that they were complementary. Luca was the blade, Nico the sheath. Neither worked without the other. "She's intelligent," Luca said. "Self-possessed. She built a non-profit that appears to actually function." "Is she pretty?" Luca looked at him. "I'm asking," Nico said, "because you have the particular expression you get when you've encountered something you don't know what to do with." "I don't have an expression like that." "You absolutely have an expression like that." Nico took his drink. "You had it when you first saw the Benini in Rome. You had it when you worked out the Chicago deal. You had it right now when I asked about her." Luca turned back to his briefing. "She's fine." "Fine," Nico repeated, as though the word were a diagnosis. "She's beautiful," Luca said, with the flat precision of a man being accurate about a fact. "She's also the most controlled person I've met in recent memory, and I'm not sure she has any interest in this arrangement beyond strategic compliance." "Do you?" The question landed with more weight than Nico had probably intended. Luca turned it over. "I have an interest in it being functional," he said. "That's what I'm working toward." "Functional?" Nico said. "Right." He took a drink. "Does she know what functional means to you? Because I have a feeling that for you, functional and for a normal person, functional are extremely different things." Luca said nothing. Below them, through the smoked glass, the club pulsed with bodies and bass, and the particular electricity of beautiful people spending money they might or might not have. He watched it with the detached appreciation of a man who had built the container, but was never fully inside the thing he'd made. "She has conditions," he said. "Conditions," Nico said, and laughed. Actually laughed. "God, I like her already." "You haven't met her?" "No, but any woman who makes conditions with Salvatore Vitali's firstborn has excellent instincts, and I want to be her friend." He set down his glass. "Luca, listen, I know you've decided to approach this like a business arrangement. It is a business arrangement. But I've also known you your entire life, and I know that the last time you looked at someone the way I suspect you just looked at this woman—" He stopped. "I'm just saying, don't lock it in a box before it has a chance to be something." Luca looked at him. Nico had the particular quality of love that made honesty feel like a gift rather than an attack. It was the thing Luca had always envied about him, and the thing he was least able to replicate. "She's not interested in anything beyond the arrangement," Luca said. "You've met her twice." "I'm good at reading people." "You're good at reading threats," Nico said. "People are harder for you. You know that." He stood, smoothed his jacket. "Have dinner with her again. On purpose this time, not negotiations." He paused. "And Luca, don't lead with the room you keep everything locked in. That room has a leakage problem." He left, moving back toward the stairs with the easy confidence of a man who knew he'd said the thing that needed saying and didn't require acknowledgement. Luca looked back down through the smoked glass. He picked up his phone. He opened Valentina's contact. He'd entered it from the card she'd pressed into his hand on that West Village sidewalk, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone completing a task, and typed, "I'm told I should invite you to dinner again. Thursday, not negotiations." He stared at it for 30 seconds. He sent it. Her response came 4 minutes later. "Not negotiations is redundant. We already covered the negotiable items, but yes, Thursday works." He set the phone down. He took a drink of his whiskey. Below him, the club moved and breathed. He thought about a woman in a burgundy dress standing at a window with her back to a room that was trying to sell her. He thought about honesty as a condition. He thought, Nico is not entirely wrong. Then he picked up his briefing again because there were 3 ongoing security assessments, a distribution dispute in Brooklyn, and 2 feds who'd been seen near the Chelsea warehouse, and none of those things would solve themselves. He was very good at this part. The work, the strategy, the relentless architecture of control. He had been doing it since his father first brought him into meetings at 17, translating everything he was feeling into action. He had learned very young that feeling was not the enemy of competence. Sentimentality was. And the distance between feeling and sentiment was the length of his entire spine. He worked until 2 in the morning. He drove home in the dark, taking the long way through downtown Manhattan, the way he sometimes did when he needed to feel the city rather than think about it. He told himself it was a business arrangement. He almost believed it. They met for dinner on Thursday at a restaurant he chose, a Japanese whiskey bar in Tribeca with excellent food and the kind of ambiance that required dark clothing and comfort with silence. He had chosen it because it was his, and he had been aware, making the choice, that he was giving something up by doing it. She would see it as his territory, which meant she would see something about him. She arrived in a black coat over something simple and dark, and he was standing at the bar when she came in and watched her cross the room with the particular quality of attention he'd been trying to categorize since the night at Oyster Bay. She moved like someone who had been taught to make herself small and had refused the lesson. Upright, unhurried, taking up exactly the space she needed, and no more. "Nice place," she said, sitting down. "It's mine," he said. "One of them." She looked around, not surreptitiously, but with direct curiosity, cataloguing details in the way he recognized because he did the same thing. "The staff all know you without looking at you," she said. "It's the peripheral attention. They're watching you without watching you." "Occupational awareness," he said. "On whose part?" "Both." She smiled at that. It was the first time he'd seen her smile without any social purpose behind it, just the quick, involuntary thing that happened when someone said something that landed. It changed her face in a way that was slightly inconvenient. They ordered. The conversation found its own level, which surprised him. He had expected the careful navigation of the first meeting, the negotiated terrain. Instead, she talked about a grant presentation she'd given that week to a city arts committee, and the particular frustration of committees that added bureaucratic layers to the simple act of giving children access to music. He found himself, against expectation, genuinely interested. The city council rep actually said, and I quote, "We need to ensure this aligns with our 5-year arts initiative framework," she said, to a presentation about after-school violin lessons. I smiled and said absolutely, knowing that the framework he was referencing had been tabled indefinitely in 2022. You knew he didn't know that. I absolutely knew he didn't know that. And? And we got the grant. She said it without triumph, just satisfaction. I've gotten very good at letting people feel like they're in control of the outcome while steering the outcome myself. He looked at her. That's a useful skill in your family. It's a useful skill in any family, she said. The lightness in her voice dimmed slightly. I learned it from my father, which is... She stopped, started again. He taught me a lot of useful things. You love him, Luca said. Not a question. Yes. She turned her glass of wine slowly. I'm angry at him right now. I love him anyway. It's not a contradiction. No, he agreed. It's not. A pause settled between them, not uncomfortable. Outside, Manhattan did its constant, urgent thing, unaware of their particular gravity. What did you learn from yours? She asked. He considered deflecting. He was very good at deflecting. It was an art form in his family, the tactical non-answer, the acknowledgement that redirected. He decided, with the small internal shift that decisions sometimes made, not to. How to be patient, he said. My father is the most patient man I've ever met. He can want something for 10 years and pursue it without urgency, without rage, without the kind of impatience that makes men make mistakes. He just waits, works, adjusts. He paused. I learned that from him. It's probably the most useful thing he ever taught me. And the least useful? He hadn't expected the follow-up. He held her gaze. That feelings are a liability, he said. I'm still deciding whether that one's true. Her expression changed. Something opened in it, briefly, like a door airing a room, and then settled back. But he'd seen it. My mother taught me to play piano, she said, shifting, and he understood it as a kind of reciprocity. She was giving him something in return. Not well, I never practiced enough, but she taught me enough that I can still play. After she died, I sat at her piano for 3 hours the first day. I didn't play anything. I just sat there, with my hands on the keys. She paused. I think I was waiting to feel her there. I think I was waiting for the music to do what music is supposed to do. Did it? Eventually. Her voice was even, but the evenness was deliberate. That's when I started the foundation. It wasn't altruism, not at first. It was... I didn't know what to do with all of it. The money, the grief, the thing she never got to do. She looked at him directly. So I did it for other people. It turned into altruism later, or something that passes for it. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about the photograph of her he'd been given, the gala image, the careful social smile. He thought about the woman who had just told him her mother's death was the origin of the most important thing in her life. He thought about how much work it took to be that honest with someone, and how she'd done it without apparent effort. You're different than I expected, he said. Everyone says that, she told him. They expect either a crime princess or a civilian. No one expects something in between. What are you? She considered the question with what seemed like genuine thought. Someone who understands the world I came from without being consumed by it, she said, or trying not to be. The jury's still out on the consumed part. He thought, I know that particular effort. He thought, we are more alike than I was prepared for. He did not say this, but he kept it. After dinner, walking out into the sharp October dark, she stopped on the sidewalk and turned to him with the directness that he was starting to recognize as her particular mode. Can I ask you something honestly? She said. You didn't need to announce it. I know, but this is... She tilted her head slightly. Are you afraid of this? Any of it? The question was unguarded in a way that felt like it cost her something to ask. He looked at her in the glow of the city at night, the way light from windows fell across her face, the way she was standing with that same particular uprightness, giving nothing away except that she'd asked. Yes, he said. She blinked. She had clearly not expected yes. I'm afraid of... He considered the precise architecture of the answer. I'm afraid of doing it badly. I've done other things badly. I don't like the experience. She studied him for a moment, then, me too. And then, before the admission could become more than it was, good night, Luca. She said his name the same way he said hers, like it was a handle she was learning the weight of. It landed in his chest with the specificity of something aimed. Good night, he said. He watched her get into her car. He watched the taillights disappear around the corner. He stood on the Tribeca sidewalk for a moment longer than necessary. He was very, very good at compartments. He went home and sat in his dark office and stared at the park for a long time, and the compartment did not hold. They were married on the 15th of January in a Catholic church in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, where the Vitale family had attended Mass for 3 generations, in a ceremony attended by exactly 42 people, most of whom had committed federal crimes at some point in their careers. Valentina wore white because her aunt had cried about it, and because she had decided that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it completely. The dress was not elaborate, a column of silk crepe with long sleeves and a high neckline, simple to the point of severity, the kind of dress that required the wearer to carry it rather than being carried by it. She had bought it herself. She had not asked anyone's opinion. Her father walked her down the aisle. She held his arm and did not look at the pews on either side, the faces of 2 crime families arranged in parallel rows, watching her pass with the variety of expressions that such an occasion generated. Sentimental, political, calculating, curious. She looked at the altar. She looked at the man standing at the altar. Luca Vitale in a black suit was a different thing than Luca Vitale at a restaurant. He was fully in his gravity here, standing straight in the way he stood in all spaces. But there was something in him today that was pulled tighter than usual. She would have called it nervousness in anyone else. In him, she wasn't sure it had a name. He was watching her come toward him, with an expression she couldn't read, his dark eyes travelling the length of her approach with the unhurried attention that had startled her the first time she'd felt it and now startled her again, differently. She reached the altar. He offered his hand to help her up the single step. She took it. His grip was warm and steady, and he didn't release her immediately, a beat longer than the step required. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. close enough that she could see everything his face had been keeping from the room all these weeks of careful distance. A complexity there, something that was not indifference and was not cold. She couldn't name it. She tucked it into the part of her mind where she kept things she needed to return to. The priest spoke. She said the words. He said the words. His voice was steady and low, and she heard every syllable. I do. Her voice, when it was her turn, was steadier than she'd expected. She was proud of herself for that. When he put the ring on her finger, plain platinum, no ornamentation, exactly what she'd asked for. His thumb pressed briefly against her knuckle. Not pressure, just contact, an acknowledgement. He kissed her at the priest's direction, and it was brief and contained and entirely unlike anything she'd been steeling herself for. He placed his hand on the side of her face with a care that was nearly foreign to the context of everything she knew about him, and pressed his lips to hers for 3 seconds. And when he stepped back, his hand didn't drop immediately. She looked at him. He looked at her. The room applauded. The reception was at the Vitale penthouse on the Upper West Side, the family's primary residence, which she had been inside exactly once for a walk-through 2 weeks prior, to make sure she knew the geography. She would be moving in within the month. This had been negotiated with the clinical practicality that they'd brought to everything, and she had stood in the master bedroom and said, I'll need the second room for a workspace. And he had said, of course. And she had felt the strangeness of it land in her body the way it had been landing intermittently for weeks. This is real. This is happening. This is the architecture of a life she was now building inside a structure she had not designed. The reception was fine, controlled. The food was extraordinary, the service invisible and perfect. The flowers, whatever she'd chosen from 3 options, someone had emailed her and she'd selected in 30 seconds. Her father danced with her and held her a little more tightly than the dance required, and she pressed her face briefly into his shoulder and thought, I know what this is. I know what you need it to be. I'll give you that. Nico Vitali found her at the bar an hour in, appearing at her elbow with the ease of someone who moved through rooms by invitation. You survived, he said. She looked at him. Luca's brother had the most open face of anyone in the room. It was almost disarming how legible he was in a company of men who specialized in being unreadable. The ceremony or the day? She asked. Both. He signaled the bartender, got 2 glasses of champagne, and handed her one without asking whether she wanted it. I'm Nico, since we've been in rooms at a distance but never actually met. I know who you are. Right, you did research. He said it approvingly. Luca mentioned. He mentioned my research. He mentioned you were thorough. It was a compliment in his language. Nico looked out at the room. He's been... He paused. You should know he's trying. In the way he tries at things, it doesn't look like other people's trying. What does it look like? Like nothing, Nico said. Like he's just standing there, but that's because all the effort is internal. He's been trying since the first dinner. He took a drink. I'm telling you because no one else will, and because I think you deserve the translation. She absorbed this. Across the room, she could see Luca in conversation with 2 men she recognized as Chicago partners, his posture contained and authoritative, his face giving nothing away. But even from this distance, she saw what Nico meant. There was something in the set of his shoulders, a quality of attention he was maintaining for the room. She'd watched people for enough of her life to see it. "He doesn't show things," she said. "He doesn't know how," Nico said, not unkindly. "He learned very early that showing things was expensive. He's been paying that particular cost ever since." He turned to look at her directly. "I hope you'll be patient with him." She thought about the night he'd told her he was afraid of doing it badly. She thought about his thumb on her knuckle at the altar. "I'm working on patience," she said. Nico smiled, wide, genuine, the smile of someone who could afford to feel things without calculating the cost. "I think you're going to be good for him," he said. "I think it's too early to tell." The ones who are good for him are always the ones who say it's too early to tell. He clinked his glass to hers. "Welcome to the family, Valentina." He drifted back into the room. She held her champagne and stood in her husband's penthouse in her wedding dress and tried to locate the feeling that the word husband produced. It was not what she'd feared. That was the most honest thing she could say about it. It was not what she'd feared, and she didn't entirely know what to do with that. Living with Luca Vitale was nothing like she'd expected, which meant it was also nothing she'd prepared for. She had expected coldness. She had prepared for the particular chill of a man going through the motions of a shared life, without any actual interest in the person sharing it. The kind of performative cohabitation she'd seen in other arranged marriages in their world, where two people occupied the same space like satellites in parallel orbits, never intersecting unless the choreography required it. She got something else. He was present. That was the thing she hadn't anticipated, the quality of his attention when she was in the room, not hovering, not intrusive, just there. He noticed things without commenting on them, that she made coffee the same way every morning, that she worked late when she was frustrated and early when she was energized, that she didn't eat when she was anxious and ate elaborate meals when she was happy. He didn't narrate these observations. He simply, quietly, adjusted around them. The first week, he asked if she wanted to use the study or preferred a different workspace, and showed her 3 rooms without marketing any of them. She chose a room with eastern light, and he had her books moved from her apartment without being asked. The second week, she came home from a foundation board meeting at 11 at night, exhausted and fraying at the edges from 4 hours of administrative friction, and found a plate of food in the oven. Simple pasta, kept warm, nothing elaborate. She stood in front of the open oven door for a long moment before taking the plate. He was in the living room. He looked up from his reading when she came through with the pasta. "The Greco Foundation board meetings," he said. "They're always this long. They're always this long when the treasurer and the program director hate each other," she said, "which is always." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but in the same territory. She sat on the opposite end of the long sectional sofa, the pasta in her lap, and he went back to his reading. They sat like that for 40 minutes. It was the most comfortable 40 minutes she'd experienced since moving in, and the fact that it was comfortable was deeply alarming. She was not supposed to be comfortable here. She was supposed to be strategic. She was supposed to be executing an arrangement. She was sitting in her husband's penthouse eating pasta he'd kept warm for her and finding it difficult to locate her own armor. The difficulty increased incrementally as the weeks passed. He trained in the mornings before she was awake. She knew this because she was sometimes awake in the early dark hours and could hear faintly the rhythm of movement from the building's private gym 2 floors below their unit. He didn't talk about it. When she asked, once, he said, Discipline compounds, and went back to his espresso with the efficiency of a man who had answered the question and moved on. She found this both irritating and inexplicably charming. He worked long hours. He was also, when he was present, genuinely present, which was the more confusing of the two facts. He could sit in a room with her and actually be there, not running through operations in his head or delivering the absent-minded partial attention of a man whose focus lived elsewhere. When he talked to her, he listened with the kind of concentration that felt like being taken seriously. She was not used to being taken seriously by men in her world. 3 weeks in, she arrived home to find him in the kitchen. Their kitchen, she was still recalibrating for hour, making something with obvious competence. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched for a moment without announcing herself. He was cooking with the same contained precision he applied to everything, and she noted with a pang of something inconvenient the way his hands moved, sure and deliberate, the same hands that had placed a ring on her finger, that had held her face at the altar. She had been avoiding thinking about the kiss. She had been avoiding it systematically and with significant discipline. She stopped avoiding it now, briefly, in the privacy of the kitchen doorway, while he didn't know she was watching. 3 seconds of his lips on hers, his hand on the side of her face, the care in it. She stepped into the kitchen. "You cook." He looked up. No surprise, she suspected he'd heard her come in. "I learned because I don't like the alternative." "Which is?" "Other people in my space." She sat at the kitchen island. "Should I be worried about that as a criterion?" "You're already here," he said, which was not quite an answer, and also somehow was. "You eat fish?" "Yes." "Good." He turned back to the stove. She watched him cook. She opened the wine that was sitting on the counter, already opened, and poured 2 glasses without asking, setting one beside him, and he picked it up without comment. They ate at the kitchen table, rather than the formal dining room, which had been her initiative on the second night, and which had become, without discussion, the default. The dining room was for the dinners that were performances, the ones with his father or her father, or the people who needed to see the arrangement in its formal clothes. The kitchen was for the nights that were just theirs. She thought about that, theirs, and felt the word settle somewhere it hadn't been before. After dinner, he said without particular preamble, "I need to go to Chicago next week, 3 days. There are some issues with the partners there that require my presence." "All right," she said. "I'm telling you in advance," he said, and it took her a moment to realize he was referencing the condition she'd stated at their second dinner. "You tell me things in advance." He had remembered. He had catalogued it and was applying it weeks later without ceremony. She looked at him across the kitchen table. "Thank you," she said. He met her eyes. Something moved through his face, brief, quiet. Then he nodded and looked back at his wine. She thought, this is a dangerous kind of comfort. She thought, I should be more careful. She thought. He remembered. She was still thinking about it an hour later, working in her east-facing study with the city spread below her like a circuit board running on light, when she heard his footsteps in the hall, and then the pause at her door, which was open, and she looked up. He was in the doorway with 2 glasses of water. "You forget," he said simply, setting one on her desk. She looked at the glass. She hadn't had anything to drink in 3 hours, which meant she probably had the beginnings of a dehydration headache starting at the base of her skull. "You notice too much," she said. "I noticed the right amount," he replied, and left. She stared at the water glass. She thought, "I am in serious trouble." She picked up the glass and drank, and returned to her work and tried to maintain the architecture of her own careful distance. The architecture was developing cracks. The night of the gala was the first time the city saw them as a unit. It was a benefit for the Philharmonic, an annual event on the Upper East Side that functioned as one of those rare social occasions where legitimate New York and its shadowed parallel world occupied the same ballroom, sustained by the mutual agreement to see only what was convenient. Valentina had attended for 6 consecutive years as the head of the Greco Foundation, which was a donor of standing. This year she was attending as Valentina Vitali. She had not yet decided how she felt about the name. She used it on the invitation, had been aware of it as a line crossed, and had filed the emotional response under to be examined later. They arrived together. He had a car, of course he had a car, he always had a car, and she sat in the back next to him in a dress of midnight blue silk, and he wore black on black, and they did not talk on the way there. But the silence was the kind she'd come to recognize as his comfortable register, and she was no longer unsettled by it. The arrival itself was efficient. They got out. He came to her side of the car without fuss. She had noticed that he moved to place himself between her and the street whenever they were in public, a physical calculation so habitual in him that she suspected he didn't know he did it, and they walked in. The effect on the room was immediate and not subtle. She felt it. The particular frequency of collective attention, the shift in conversational energy when they entered. She had experience with this. Her father's presence generated it, and she'd spent years learning to move through that particular electromagnetic field without visibly registering it. She straightened her spine fractionally. Luca's hand, which had been resting at the small of her back, with the light impersonal touch they'd developed for public occasions, pressed more firmly for exactly 1 second. She understood. "I see it. I'm here." She walked into the room. The evening went smoothly for about 2 hours. She circulated with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this since she was 19, shaking hands and discussing the foundation and accepting congratulations on the marriage with a warmth that was entirely real by the time she'd given it 20 times, because the alternative was showing how complicated real felt. The problem arrived in the form of Marcus Cavalletti. Marcus was 31, the youngest son of a Tribeca real estate dynasty that had been laundering money for the De Luca family for 15 years. And he was someone Valentina had briefly, regrettably dated 3 years ago. Brief and regrettable because Marcus had been charming and handsome, and constitutionally incapable of fidelity, and because the 3 months they'd been together had functioned primarily as evidence that her taste, under stress, tended toward men who reflected her own damage back at her in attractive packaging. He appeared at her elbow while she was between conversations, a champagne flute in his hand, and the particular energy of someone who had been watching for an opportunity. "Valentina," he said. The way he said her name was a specific kind of acoustic trespass. "Congratulations on the wedding. I read about it. Marcus." Her voice was even. She was very good at even. "How are you?" "Better now." He smiled the smile she remembered being charmed by. "You look extraordinary." "Thank you." She moved to step sideways to create the natural exit that said, "Good to see you, moving on." He stepped with her, subtly, not a block, but a redirect. "I heard the Vitali match," he said, lower. "I never thought you'd go through with something like that. I always thought, I'm sure you thought many things, Marcus." She kept her voice warm and final. "If you'll excuse me." She felt it before she saw it, the specific shift in the air pressure to her left that meant Luca had come up on her periphery. She turned her head slightly. He was there, not between her and Marcus, not in any posture of confrontation, just present, at her shoulder, the way he'd been present in that kitchen doorway, in that study, on that West Village sidewalk. He said nothing. He simply looked at Marcus Cavalletti with the quality of attention that made rooms rearrange themselves. Marcus Cavalletti, to his credit, understood the reorientation immediately. "Luca Vitali," he said, his voice going carefully easy. "I didn't realize." "I think you did," Luca said, pleasantly. The pleasantness was precise and had a distinct bottom to it. Marcus departed with such natural smoothness that it was almost admirable. Valentina did not look at Luca immediately. She took a breath, recalibrated her shoulders. "I could have handled that," she said. "You were handling it?" he said. "I was just present." She turned to look at him. He was watching Marcus's retreating back with an expression that was nearly meditative, no anger in it, or not the visible kind, something quieter and more absolute, the kind of feeling that didn't need expression because it was already resolved. "He's a nothing," she said. "I know what he is." Luca looked back at her, and whatever had been on his face for Marcus was gone. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." She held his gaze. Was that jealousy?" "That was possession," he said simply. "There's a distinction." She opened her mouth and closed it. "Possession," he clarified, "meaning you are, in any context that matters, mine to protect, not mine to control. The distinction exists, and it's important." She stared at him. He looked back at her with the level directness she'd come to expect, offering the information without apology or performance. "Mine to protect," she repeated. "Yes." "Since when?" He considered this with the thoughtful pauses she'd come to recognize as a sign that he was answering honestly rather than reflexively. "Since the photograph," he said finally. "What photograph?" "The one I was given, before any of this. You were at a window." A pause. "I didn't like the way the situation was framing you." She had no response to that. She stood in a glittering ballroom in a midnight blue dress with her husband's words in her chest and no appropriate place to put them. "Dance with me," she said, because it was the only thing she could think of that would put her hands somewhere, rather than nowhere. He looked at her for a moment. Then he took her hand and led her to the floor. He danced the way he did everything, with contained, unhurried certainty. His hand was at her waist, the other holding hers, and they moved through the music without performing it, which made her feel them both in it rather than above it. She was close enough to feel the warmth of him, close enough that when she looked up, his face was nearer than she was prepared for. "Since the photograph," she said quietly, not looking away. "Yes," he said. She let herself be held by that, briefly, in the way you let yourself be held by things that have structural weight, carefully aware of what you're leaning on. They danced until the song ended. She didn't step back immediately. He didn't either. The threat came on a Tuesday, which seemed wrong. Threats in their world should have come on darker nights with appropriate atmospheric weight. Instead, it was an ordinary Tuesday in February, and Valentina was in her study reviewing grant proposals when Daniel, the head of their household security, knocked on her door with the expression she'd learned to read as controlled emergency. "There's been an incident," he said. "Mr. Vitali is on his way back. He asks that you stay in the penthouse." She was already on her feet. "What kind of incident?" "A car was found outside your foundation's main office. Package inside." He chose his words with the careful precision of someone who had been instructed to say enough but not everything. "It's been handled by our team. No one was injured." "A package," she said. "A bomb?" "Precautionary sweep is ongoing. The office was clear." He met her eyes. "Mr. Vitali is 20 minutes out." She understood the instruction embedded in his update, "Stay put." She understood it, and she was not good at following instructions of this kind, not because she was reckless, but because she was someone who needed to understand the full dimensions of what she was dealing with in order to function. She stayed in the penthouse. She was standing at the window, the large west-facing one that framed the park in its winter grey, when she heard the penthouse elevator engage. She knew his footsteps by now, the specific pattern of them, the rhythm. She heard them cross the foyer, and then he was in the doorway, and she turned. He looked at her, a sweep of his gaze that was almost tactile, checking, calibrating. Then, "You're all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "I was here. What happened?" He crossed the room, and she watched his face. It was doing that thing it did when he was managing something large. The sealed quality turned up to maximum, and under it, if you knew where to look, the particular compression that was the closest he came to visible fear. A car was parked outside the Foundation office on 125th Street, he said. Our surveillance team flagged it at 9 a.m. Inside was a package, not a bomb, a message. He stopped. "A photograph. Of you." She held very still. "Of me. Taken recently, entering the office 3 days ago." He was watching her carefully. "Someone has been watching you." "Who?" "We're working on it." He said it without the usual clean closure that he brought to operational information, which told her they didn't know yet, and that not knowing was costing him something significant. "DeLuca," she said. It wasn't a guess. The DeLuca family was the third power in New York's underworld, diminished but not gone, sidelined by the Greco-Vitali conflict of recent years, with both families too distracted to notice that the DeLucas had been quietly building something. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, the calibrated surprise of a man whose assessment has been confirmed faster than expected. "We think so," he said. "The marriage destabilized their position. The peace between our families closed off access to territories they'd been moving into during the conflict." He paused. "They would benefit from disrupting the peace. So they targeted the Foundation," she said. "Because it's mine, and because I'm—" She stopped. "Because you're the bridge," he said quietly. "The peace itself." She absorbed this. The cold weight of it, the specific ugliness, that the thing she'd built, the thing that was most genuinely hers, was now a pressure point in someone else's war. She turned back to the window. He let her have the moment. "I need the office operational," she said. I have 37 students mid-semester in Harlem. I have grant disbursements pending. I need the office operational. I know, he said. We'll have a security presence there by tomorrow morning. Unobtrusive, plain clothes, two-person team. I'll need to know your schedule in advance going forward. All right? Valentina. His voice changed a register. She turned to look at him. He was standing a few feet away with an expression that had dropped the operational layer just slightly. This is my fault. The target on you, that's mine to carry. She looked at him for a long moment. Is it your fault that you agreed to a peace that made us a target? I agreed to the peace. So did I, she said. So did my father and yours. No one person is carrying this. She paused. Don't shoulder all of it. It's... She stopped. It's not accurate. He looked at her with that particular quality of attention that she'd spent 3 months recalibrating herself around. You're protecting me, he said, quiet as discovery, from my own accounting. I'm being accurate, she said, which was the same thing in a different language. The silence between them was different from the usual kind, more charged, more present, the kind of silence that had weight and temperature. He moved, 2 steps forward, and suddenly they were close, not touching, but close enough that she was aware of everything about the geometry of him, the particular gravity. I don't want you hurt, he said. It was the most stripped-back thing she'd ever heard him say. No strategic frame, no operational context, just the fact of it, offered without armor. She looked up at him. I know, she said. If something happened to you... He stopped, started again. I would... Another stop. She watched him navigate the uncharted territory of saying something that was not bounded by operational language, and the difficulty of it was so visible and so entirely unlike his usual seamlessness that it did something significant to the inside of her chest. Luca, she said. He looked at her. I know, she said again. Differently. He reached up and touched her face, the same hand that had held her at the altar, with the same care. His thumb at her cheekbone, just resting there, just present. She put her hand over his, just for a moment, just to say, I'm here. I'm whole. This is real. His exhale was barely audible, but she heard it. They stood there in the blue-grey light of the February window, 2 people who had been sold into something and had found their way, unexpectedly, to the edge of choosing it. Then his phone rang, and he dropped his hand and stepped back, and the operational world flooded back in, and she turned to the window and pressed her palm to the cold glass. She thought, I am not executing an arrangement anymore, she thought. This is much more complicated than arrangement. She was right about both of those things. March arrived with the first warmth, tentative and unreliable, the kind of warmth that retracted and returned unpredictably so that you never quite trusted it. She felt a kinship with it. She had stopped pretending, somewhere in the depths of February, that she was maintaining appropriate emotional distance. The pretense had become too expensive, and she was too honest with herself and had too much practice calling honesty a condition to sustain a fiction that had ceased serving any protective function. She was falling for her husband. This was the fact she woke up with on a cold Friday morning in the 3rd month of their marriage, as clear and immovable as the skyline through the bedroom window. She was falling for a man who cooked without being asked, and remembered that she forgot to drink water and pressed his thumb to her knuckle at an altar and said mine to protect with a specificity that had permanently rearranged something in her chest. This was either a disaster or an extraordinary piece of luck, and she was not yet certain which. He was harder to read. She had become very good at reading him. She was an attentive person, dealing with a man who communicated in the register of action and proximity rather than declaration, which required a translation skill she was still developing. But she knew something was different in him, had known it for weeks. The quality of his attention had shifted. He had always been present. Now the presence had a particular heat that she felt across rooms, across conversations, in the silences between things said. He hadn't touched her, not beyond the careful, negotiated contact of their public appearances and the single moment by the window after the threat, which she was not sure she could accurately categorize because it had been both too much and not enough. She thought about it more than was useful. She was thinking about it on a Friday night when he came home earlier than expected. She was in the kitchen with a glass of wine and a newspaper. The domestic specificity of it so far from what either of them had imagined that she sometimes caught herself smiling at the contrast. And he stopped in the kitchen doorway the way he sometimes did, as though recalibrating for the fact of her. "You're home early," she said. Chicago called off the meeting. He loosened his tie, a gesture she'd never seen him make before. It suggested something was coming apart at the edges. He set his jacket over a chair, also unusual. He usually hung it, and sat down across from her. She looked at him. "Talk to me," she said. He looked up. "About? Whatever it is that you walked in carrying." A pause. Then, with the carefulness of someone unused to having a safe place to set things down. "We have a name for the DeLuca situation. Tell me." "Felix DeLuca, Marco's youngest nephew. He's been running the family's operation since Marco Sr. had his stroke last year, a compression, which we should have noticed sooner. He's 28 and volatile, and he's building something. The photograph was a statement, not an action plan. Yet. But it becomes one. It becomes one if he thinks the piece is real," Luca said. "If he thinks the Greco-Vitale alliance is stable, he loses access to everything he needs to expand. So his play is destabilization." He paused. "The obvious route is you." She absorbed this without flinching. "Because I'm the most visible symbol of the piece. Because you're the softest target and the highest value simultaneously," he said. "I don't mean—" He stopped. "I mean strategically." "I know what you mean," she considered. "He also thinks I'm a vulnerability." "Yes. He thinks that because he assumes you don't actually—" She stopped, started differently. "He thinks this is still a political arrangement, that I'm a symbol, not a person who matters to you." The word matters landed between them. Luca looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression she'd never seen on him before, something unguarded, something that was the opposite of the sealed quality she'd spent months learning to read around, something almost desperate in its precision. "You matter," he said, "not performatively. The way you said something true when the alternative was lying by omission." She held his gaze. "Tell me something else that's true," she said, quietly, testing something. He was still for a long moment. She watched him navigate the distance between what he felt and his ability to say it, and she thought, Nico was right. This is what his trying looks like. It looks like nothing from the outside, From the inside, it's everything. I think about you constantly, he said. I have since the night at my father's house, which I am fully aware makes no rational sense given the timeline. I think about you, and I think about everything that could happen to you, and I think— He stopped. His voice was controlled, but the control was visible, which for him was the equivalent of a man twice broken down. I think I was wrong about feelings being a liability. I think I was wrong, and I am not accustomed to being wrong about things that cost this much. She didn't move. She sat across the kitchen table from him in the honest light of a Friday night, a man who had just dismantled his own architecture in front of her, and she thought about everything she'd been telling herself since January. This is an arrangement. This is strategic. This is not what it feels like. Come here, she said. He stood. He came around the table. She stood to meet him, and when he reached her, he stopped just at the border of contact, the same close but not touching geometry from the February window, except that this time she closed the gap. She put her hands on either side of his face, mirroring, intentional, the way he'd held her at the altar, and looked at him. I think you're wrong about one thing, she said. Only one? In this context, she almost smiled. You think I'm not choosing this. You've been treating it like a business arrangement, even after it stopped being one, because you were waiting to see if I would. She stopped. I'm choosing this, she said. I want you to know that. I'm choosing this. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he kissed her. It was not like the altar. There was nothing brief or contained about it. He kissed her, with the full weight of everything he'd been keeping in those compartments, one hand in her hair and the other at her waist pulling her in, and she kissed him back, with the force of a woman who had been holding herself carefully at a distance for 3 months, and was done being careful. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the city was being itself. She thought, distantly, that this was the part she had not prepared for. Not the arrangement or the ceremony or the slow accumulation of domestic proximity that had become more real than the contract they'd signed. This, the specific, undeniable, inconveniently precise fact of wanting him. She had not prepared for this. She was glad. What changed after the kitchen was everything, and also nothing visible. The operational reality of their lives remained what it was. She ran the foundation. He ran an empire. The security presence at her office continued. The threat from Felix DeLuca remained ambient and real and ongoing. None of that had resolution. These were not the kinds of problems that had a single act of clarity, after which the path opened. What changed was simpler and more complex simultaneously. They stopped performing the distance. In the mornings, when she came out of the bedroom, he would be in the kitchen already, and instead of the careful neutrality of the first months, she'd feel his eyes on her in a way he no longer tried to make invisible. She'd sit down across from him and they'd talk, really talk, not the careful terrain mapping of negotiating strangers, but the kind of conversation that followed its own logic, that wandered and doubled back and sometimes ended in long silences that were entirely comfortable. He touched her differently, not dramatically. He was not a dramatic man, but with the settled ease of someone who no longer kept his hands carefully neutral. Her shoulder, in passing, her hand when she said something that mattered, the back of her neck, briefly, in a gesture so intimate she'd had to consciously not react visibly. She was aware, in a way that was both new and deeply familiar, of the specific nature of wanting someone who was already in your life, already in your home, already knowing your particular rhythms and defaults. It was different from every other want she'd known. It was quieter and larger simultaneously. They were in his office, the home office, the dark wood, and the window framing the park, on a Sunday evening when she said something that she hadn't planned. She was reading on the couch that sat along the wall of his office. He was at his desk. They had been in the same room in silence for an hour, each in their own work, which had also become something she no longer thought about. The ease of shared silence with someone whose presence felt structural rather than intrusive. She looked up at him. He was reading something, a document, his brows slightly furrowed. The lamp on his desk made a warm island of light in the dark room. "I love you," she said. He went entirely still. Not dramatically, not visibly. She might not have caught it if she hadn't spent months learning to read him. A full second of absolute stillness, the document unmoving in his hands. Then he turned. He looked at her across the office with the expression she'd been seeing more of since the kitchen. The one that showed things, the unguarded version of him that was the most frightening and most beautiful thing she'd encountered in a life that had not exactly been short on either quality. He stood and crossed the office, and she sat up on the couch as he reached her and crouched down in front of her, a gesture so entirely unlike his usual upright authority that it caught her breath, so that they were level, face to face, close. "Say that again," he said, low and exact. She looked at him. "I love you." Something moved through him. She could see it, the way seismic events are visible in the surface of still water. His jaw tightened and released. His eyes closed for 1 second. Then he said, with the careful precision of a man giving something irretrievable, "I've been in love with you since you called my name a condition." He paused. "Since the second dinner, since you said your mother's name with that." He stopped. "I have been in love with you, and I have been watching you be brave in this situation that I put you in. And I've been afraid to tell you because I was afraid it would be another thing asking something of you." She reached for his face with both hands, the way she'd done in the kitchen, and this time she felt him press into it. The slight lean into her palms that was the quietest, most undone thing she'd ever seen from a man like him. "Nothing is asking you anything," she said. "This is just true. Both of us." "Both of us," he said. "Yes." He put his hands over hers, holding them to his face, and closed his eyes. They stayed like that for a long time in the lamp-lit island of his office, while the park spread grey and patient below the window, and the city did its impossible, indifferent, gorgeous thing in every direction. She thought, this is what was in the photograph. Not him, this moment. She thought, I came into this as the price of peace and found the reason for it. She thought nothing else for a while. She stayed present in the room, in his hands, in the quiet fact of it. But the city, as it always did, had its own plans. 2 floors below, in the building's security hub, a monitor was logging an anomaly on the street outside. She didn't know this yet. It would take less than 72 hours for the fire to reach them. The call came from Nico at 6 in the morning. She heard it from the bedroom, the distinct ring of the phone Luca kept for family calls, the one that was different from all his other phones, the one whose ring he'd programmed to be unmistakable. She heard him answer on the second ring, which meant he was already awake, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the quality of the silence after he answered. She was sitting up before he came through the bedroom door. He was in the doorway holding the phone, and she saw it immediately. Not panic. Luca Vitali did not do panic, but the particular reconfiguration his face underwent when something significant had changed in the landscape. Felix De Luca made a move, he said. Last night, your father's house in New Jersey, a car bomb on the property. No one was hurt. The car was one of the perimeter vehicles, no occupants. He paused. It's a message. She was out of bed and reaching for her phone. I need to call him, she said. Already done. Nico spoke to Carmine 20 minutes ago. Your father is contained. His people are on full alert. He paused. He wants you there. She looked at him. And you? I want you to go. I'll drive you. He was already moving. This is escalating, and we need... Luca? She stopped him with her voice. He stopped. She crossed to him and put her hand on his chest, directly over his heart, the specific location of the thing she'd only just said out loud, the irretrievable truth. We need, she said. We, not you managing it alone. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through him. We, he said. Yes. The ride to her father's compound in New Jersey took 50 minutes and contained its own specific tension. A car full of their combined security, Luca in the front going over intelligence with his head of operations, Valentina in the back calling the Foundation's director of operations to hold all scheduled visits to the office, executing the practical steps of a person whose world had a fault line running through it. Her father met them in the driveway with the compressed energy of a man who'd been sitting on crisis management for 3 hours and was grateful for movement. He hit the perimeter, Carmine said, embracing Valentina with a force that told her how afraid he'd actually been. We were lucky. He's escalating, Luca said. They had moved into the house, into the main study where Aldo and 3 of her father's capos were already assembled. This is no longer a message campaign. He's using live materials. The question is timeline and target. Us, Valentina said from where she stood at the edge of the room. Every man in the room turned to look at her. The pattern so far, she said, has been me. The Foundation, then the photograph, now my father's house, which is my childhood home. She crossed her arms. He's escalating through me. He's betting that attacking the things that matter to me will produce a response. What kind of response? Aldo asked. Fracture, she said. He wants the peace to fracture. He wants my father to pull back from the alliance because his family is being targeted. He wants Luca to retreat operationally to protect me, rather than engage. She looked at Luca. He knows we're... She stopped. Not from discomfort, from precision. He knows this is real. Luca's expression didn't change, but she saw his jaw tighten fractionally. Which means, she continued, that the thing he's actually targeting isn't property. It's us. Specifically, the fact that we chose this. The room was quiet. Her father looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not pride exactly, but recognition. Like something he'd built had exceeded his own specifications. She's right, Luca said. It was flat and conclusive, which means the response can't be retreat and can't be fracture. It has to be the opposite. Show of force, one of the capos said. Show of unity, Luca corrected. He looked at Valentina. His calculation depends on this being fragile. We need to demonstrate that it isn't. Together, she said. Together. They spent the next 6 hours in that study. It was unlike any meeting Valentina had sat in before, not because the content was more extreme than what she'd been adjacent to all her life, but because she was no longer adjacent. She was at the table. Luca had pulled her chair to the table next to his before anyone else sat down, a gesture so deliberate that the room had taken notice without comment. She spoke when she had something to add. No one questioned it. She understood that this too was a show of unity, visible, intentional to the men in the room who would carry word of it outward. There was a plan by noon. Moving parts she would not be party to, operational dimensions she didn't need or want to know, but the structure was clear. A coordinated response, both families, every resource ending the DeLuca threat before it became something that required a body count high enough to attract federal attention. She was standing at the window of the study. This window, not unlike her own, framing a different piece of landscape, when Luca came to stand beside her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes." She turned to look at him. "Are you?" "I'm better when you're in the room," he said. It was a plain, simple sentence. It was the most he had ever given her in a single statement, and it hit her somewhere deep and quiet, the place where she kept things she would need forever. "Then I'll stay in the room," she said. His hand found hers without either of them making a production of it. Outside, the New Jersey morning was cold and calm. Inside, two families were going to war. The plan was elegant in the way that Luca's plans were always elegant, spare and decisive, with a minimum of moving parts and a maximum of leverage. She had watched him work before, obliquely, through the evidence of his decisions rather than their execution. This was the first time she watched him plan something directly. It was instructive. He didn't perform authority. He didn't need to. He sat at a table and spoke in the measured, precise way he spoke everywhere, and the room organized itself around him not because of the weight of his history or the size of his operation, though both were present, but because of something in the quality of his thinking. He was calm in the way that structures are calm, load-bearing. She found this deeply, specifically attractive, which was the wrong thing to be focusing on in a war council, and she was honest enough with herself to note it and file it. The intelligence on Felix DeLuca had been assembled over 3 weeks by Luca's operations team and cross-referenced with her father's network. Felix was running a distribution hub out of a warehouse complex in Red Hook, had 4 lieutenants of variable competence, and had recently made contact with a federal informant in an attempt to leverage information about the Vitali Greco alliance as a bargaining chip. That last detail was the most dangerous. Not because the information was accurate, it wasn't, not in the specific ways the feds would need, but because the attempt indicated Felix was more desperate and more reckless than a 28-year-old running a diminished family had any right to be. Desperate and reckless men did unpredictable things. "The informant contact is the priority," Valentina said at the afternoon session. Luca looked at her. "Agreed. If he makes an exchange with the feds, even bad intelligence, it opens an investigation that neither family wants. It doesn't matter if the intel is inaccurate, an investigation is disruptive enough. Which means he has to be neutralized before the exchange," one of the capos said. "The exchange is scheduled for Friday," Luca's intelligence chief said. We have that from our own federal sources. He said it with the particular tone of a man confident in his information. 3 days. Then we have 3 days, Valentina said. What's the cleanest path? The room looked at her again. She held it. She was aware of what she was doing, entering a conversation she'd spent her whole life being kept adjacent to, choosing a specific involvement. She was also aware that the alternative was sitting in the peripheral position of someone protected by a plan, rather than contributing to it, and she had never been good at peripheral positions. Luca was watching her with something in his eyes that she identified after a moment as a specific kind of tenderness, not sentimental, the kind that meant, I see you choosing this, I see what it costs, I value it. She held his gaze for 1 second, then she looked back at the room and said, the informant contact is the softest point. If Felix loses access to that, his leverage disappears and his operation loses coherence. He's operating on the assumption that he can force a response from us, fail to get it, and then use the feds as his secondary escalation. Remove the secondary option and he's isolated. The Fed contact will need to be redirected, Aldo said carefully. Yes, she said. This was where her knowledge of certain aspects of her family's arrangements was useful. There is a deputy commissioner who has been a Greco family resource for 9 years. He has the standing to have the informant reassigned without triggering an investigation. It requires a conversation and a favor. She paused. I can make that call. Her father turned to look at her. Valentina, I've managed the relationship for the last 3 years, Pop, she said, not defiant, factual. He trusts me more than he trusts you, which is why you moved the management to me in the first place. I can make the call. A silence. Luca said quietly, this is her call to offer, or not. I won't make it for her. It was the exact right thing to say, and she loved him for it. Make the call, her father said. She made it that afternoon from a private room in her father's house on one of the encrypted phones that lived in a drawer she'd had a key to since she was 20. It was a 12-minute conversation. The deputy commissioner, a careful man who had survived 3 administrations by being useful to everyone and visible to no one, understood the situation in 4 sentences and confirmed the informant reassignment in 7. She walked back into the main room and said, it's done. The room exhaled collectively. Later, in the car back to the city, just her and Luca, the security partition up, the city arriving in the distance like a promise. He reached across and took her hand. You know, he said, I think you are significantly more dangerous than I was briefed. She looked at him. He was looking at the road, a slight curve to his mouth that was the closest thing to a smile she'd ever seen on him. Is that a problem? She asked. It is the opposite of a problem, he said. She looked at their joined hands in the dim light of the car interior. She thought about the girl who had stood in her father's study and been told she was the price of peace. She thought about the woman in the car who had just redirected a federal operation and was holding the hand of the man she'd been sold to. She thought, what a strange and specific thing it is to become yourself in someone else's story. The city came to meet them. They went home. Thursday was quiet in the way that the day before a resolution is always quiet. The specific suspension of a held breath. The city going about its ordinary life while underneath it, in the hidden infrastructure of other economies, things moved toward a point. She woke early. He was already awake, as always. She found him in the kitchen with coffee and the controlled, focused stillness that meant he was thinking through something and had been for hours. She poured her own coffee and sat across from him without speaking first. She'd learned this. He did not need her to fill silence, and the silence itself was often where he was doing something important. After several minutes, he looked up. "I want to tell you about Elena," he said. She held very still. Elena was the woman 8 months before the arrangement, the one he'd ended it with because it wasn't safe. He'd mentioned her once, briefly, as a fact without texture. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to." She waited. "We were together for 14 months, he said. She was—" He paused, choosing. "She was not part of this world. She knew what I did in the way that people sometimes know things they've agreed not to look at directly. It worked until it didn't. It stopped working when the situation with your family started escalating, and I realized that I was asking her to accept risk she hadn't consented to." He turned his coffee cup. "I ended it on a Monday. She cried. I held her while she cried, and then I left. I told myself it was the right thing for her." "Was it?" "Yes," he said. "And I told myself it didn't cost me anything, that I was calibrated for it." He looked at her. "I was lying. It cost me. I didn't have a language for it at the time. I'd been telling myself for long enough that feelings were a liability, that I didn't have a way to name what I was losing." She absorbed this. "Why are you telling me now?" "Because I don't want to do that with you," he said. "I don't want to have something I can't name and lose it before I find the words." He looked at her directly. "And because whatever happens with the DeLuca situation, I want you to know that what I said to you last night in the bedroom is the truest thing you've said," she said. "Yes." He held her gaze. "I love you." The first time he'd said it, it landed with the specific weight of something that had been building for months. Not surprising, because she'd known. She'd felt it in every precise and careful thing he'd done since January. But arresting in the way that certainty is always arresting when it speaks aloud. She got up from her side of the table. She went to him and sat on the edge of the table beside him, close enough that she could put her hand on his face the way she kept doing, the gesture that had somehow become theirs. "I love you," she said. "And I need you to know, I don't love you in spite of what you are. I love you as what you are." She paused. "All of it. The parts that are closed and the parts that are learning how not to be. The man who kept pasta warm and the man who read intelligence briefs at 4 in the morning. I love the whole composition." His hand came up to cover hers on his face. "The whole composition," he said quietly. "Yes." He leaned his head slightly into her hand, and it was the smallest, most total surrender she'd ever seen, and she held it. They stayed there in the kitchen in the early morning light, two people who had arrived at each other through strange and violent and somehow perfect circumstances, and the city did its ordinary, extraordinary thing outside the windows, and for one suspended hour, there was no war. Just this. The peace they were making, which was something different from the peace their fathers had brokered, something that was actually and completely theirs. Friday came with rain. She was at the foundation office on 125th Street, the security team in place, routine maintained, because the worst thing she could do for her staff and her students was Make them feel the tremors when her phone buzzed with a message from Luca's number. Not a text, a code, a single word that meant everything is in motion. She texted back the corresponding acknowledgement and went back to her meeting with the music program director, who was explaining a proposal to expand the violin curriculum to include an orchestra ensemble component. And she listened with genuine attention because the proposal was good, and because her students deserved her full presence, and because there was nothing for her to do right now but wait. The hardest part of the day was the waiting. She had been taught across her whole life that the women in her family waited. They held the house and the front and the ordinary infrastructure of a life while the men went out and did things that were violent and decisive. She had always understood this as a domestic deployment of women's specific strengths, the management of continuity while the world fractured and reformed. She had never loved it, but she had respected the logic. She was still waiting. But the quality of her waiting had changed. She knew the plan. She had contributed to it. She had made the call that removed the most dangerous variable. She was waiting from the inside of the thing rather than the outside. There was a difference. At 4 in the afternoon, Nico called. "It's done," he said. "Clean, no complications. Felix is in custody. His own people turned on him at the end, which tells you something about his management style. The warehouse is clear. The informant situation is resolved." He paused. "Luca will call you when he's clear." She sat down in her office chair. "Thank you, Nico," she said. "You did good," he said. "The deputy commissioner thing was—" She could hear him smiling. "That was genuinely impressive, Valentina. Don't tell my father I enjoyed it. Already told him he was delighted. A beat. Welcome to the family for real this time." She laughed. It came out of her before she knew it was coming. The relief and the absurdity of Nico Vitale saying for real this time about a family she'd been legally part of for 3 months. She laughed until her eyes were wet, and then she wiped them efficiently and called the Philharmonic's education director to confirm an upcoming student performance because life continued. Luca called at 6. "I'm coming home," he said. Just that. "I'll be there," she said. He was at the penthouse by 7. She heard the elevator, heard his steps, and stood up from the couch where she'd been working, because she couldn't sit when she heard his footsteps anymore. It was a reflex she'd stopped trying to manage. He came through the door, and she crossed the room to him, which was also a reflex, and he met her halfway, and there was none of the careful negotiated contact of earlier months. She walked into his arms, and he closed them around her, and they stood in the foyer with the city spreading gold through every window. She felt him exhale, long and slow, the release of a day's worth of pressure. "Are you hurt?" she asked into his shoulder. "No." His hand moved up her back. "Are you?" "I was here," she said. "I know." He pressed his lips to her hair. "I know. I wanted you here." She tilted her head back to look at him. He looked different. Not loose. Luca Vitale was not capable of loose, but something in him was lighter. Something that had been present in him for months, a weight she'd felt more than seen, was gone. "It's over?" she asked. "Felix De Luca is in federal custody on charges that have nothing to do with us and everything to do with 3 of his own people cooperating with prosecutors," he said. "His operation is dissolved. His family is depleted." He paused. "And the 2 families who arranged a marriage 3 months ago are not at war. She looked at him. "We're not," she agreed. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, the better thing, the predecessor to it. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "Away from the city, just for a few days. No operations, no families." He paused. "Just us." "Us," she said. "Yes." She looked at him in the gold light of their home and thought about the woman who had stood in her father's study 5 months ago and said no before she said yes, and tell me your conditions before she said anything at all. She thought, that woman was brave. This one is braver. "When do we leave?" she said. They flew to Italy on a private flight that left JFK at 11 p.m. and arrived in Naples at noon the following day. She slept for 6 hours on the plane. Actual, deep sleep, the kind that had been intermittent for weeks during the crisis, and woke to find him reading in the seat across from her, which should have been ordinary and wasn't, because the light through the plane window was hitting him in a way that made her understand again the particular visual fact of him. He looked up when she stirred. "Coffee?" "Please," she said. He poured it himself from the carafe on the table between them and handed it across, and she sat with her feet tucked under her and her hair down. She'd taken it down before sleeping, which meant she was currently in a state of significant disarray by any standard she usually applied to herself, and drank the coffee. He looked at her with an expression that was something she was still learning the full vocabulary of. Warm, in the way that warmth in him was always understated, and therefore more significant. "Stop looking at me like that," she said. "I look like I survived a transatlantic flight." "You look like yourself," he said, as though that were the resolution to the point. She looked at him for a moment. "That might be the most disarming thing you've ever said to me." "I have a list," he said, and went back to his reading. She stared at the back of his book. "You have a list." "Of disarming things to say. Of things that are true," he said, without looking up, "that also happen to have the disarming property." She burst out laughing. It was involuntary and complete, the kind of laugh that surprised her, and he looked up from his book with the ghost of a smile expression that she was hoarding like a private collection. "You're funny," she said. "I'm accurate," he said. "The effect is often similar." She laughed again, softer, and turned to look at the clouds below them. The sky at cruising altitude was a specific shade of blue that existed nowhere else. Absolute and unpolluted and entirely indifferent to everything happening below it. She pressed her palm to the cold window. "Thank you," she said. "For the coffee?" "For this." She gestured vaguely. The plane, the distance, the idea of a few days that were only theirs. "For knowing I needed it." "I needed it too," he said, plainly, without performance. "This is not only for you." She turned her head and smiled at him. He held it, held her gaze, held the smile. Let it be what it was. Positano was everything the photographs had never quite managed to convey. The town stacked itself up the cliffside in layers of white and colour, cascading down to the Tyrrhenian Sea, which was a specific shade of blue-green that seemed to be showing off. Their villa was perched high on the cliff with a private terrace that looked directly out to water, and when they arrived in the late afternoon light, she stood on that terrace for 10 minutes without speaking, held by the beauty of it. He let her have the silence. Later, eating at a small restaurant down a set of steep stairs where the owner brought them bread and oil without asking, And the wine was local and exactly right. She asked him something she'd been holding since the New Jersey meeting. When this is over, now that it is over, what do we do? He looked at her over his wine. What do you want to do? I want, she considered, I want to keep the foundation growing. I want to open a second site in Brooklyn. She paused. I want to not spend the next decade managing fear. He nodded. The DeLuca resolution changes the operational landscape. The families are consolidated. There will still be work, but the immediate kind of danger that put a target on the foundation, on you, that's resolved. He paused. I can't promise you that the world we live in becomes safe. I can promise you that I will never stop working to make it safer for you. That's not a small thing, she said. No, he agreed. She looked at him across the table in the warm Italian evening. When did you start thinking of it as for you, for me specifically? He considered. The night of the gala, he said. Marcus Cavalletti at your elbow. I walked across that room and I knew... He stopped. I knew that mine to protect was a feeling, not a calculation. There was no strategy in it. I just needed to be there. That's when I knew too, she said. He looked at her. What did you know? That you were real, she said. That what you were feeling was real, not just the arrangement being executed. She paused. I'd been waiting for the mask, waiting to see the transaction underneath. She met his eyes. There wasn't one. No, he said quietly. There wasn't. They walked back up the cliff stairs in the dark, her hand in his, the sea sound below them, the town above them glittering like a carried inheritance. In the villa on the terrace, with the Tyrrhenian sea spreading silver in the moonlight, he said her name once. Just her name in the voice she heard in its nighttime register now, the one that had nothing held back. And she turned. She could write the rest of it. She had already memorized it. The way he held her, the way the sea sounded, the specific and irreplaceable fact of being loved by someone who had learned it the hard way and offered it with the full weight of everything it cost. She held on. They returned to New York on a Wednesday. She returned to the foundation and he returned to his operations, and the ordinary, extraordinary architecture of their life resumed, with its significant structural change, the weight that had lived in both of them for months. The background frequency of danger, of managed fear, of something about to break, was gone. She felt it in the quality of mornings, in the way he came to bed without the phone, sometimes the first phone she'd seen him put down voluntarily. In the way she laughed at dinner without the sound of it feeling like a concession to circumstances. The life they were building was beginning to look like a life. Her father came to dinner 2 weeks after Positano. He sat at their kitchen table, the kitchen table, her table now, the one with the 4 chairs where they ate every night that wasn't formal, the one with the scratch on the left leg that she'd put there, herself moving in, and looked around the kitchen with the expression of a man taking an inventory that had nothing to do with the physical objects. "You're happy?" he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. He looked at Luca, who was at the stove doing something with pasta, with the focused competence that still, after months, gave her a small involuntary thrill. "You're good to her father said. Also not a question. "I'm trying," Luca said, which was the only honest answer. Her father turned back to her. He had the look he sometimes got, the one she associated with the moments he allowed himself to be simply her father, rather than Carmine Greco of the New York Grecos. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I know what I asked of you," he said. "I know it wasn't fair." She looked at him. Pop. "No, let me." He cleared his throat. "I know what I asked of you. And I think I was afraid, for a while, that the cost was too high, that I had—" He stopped. "That I'd treated you like a resource rather than my daughter." The kitchen was very quiet. Luca was being very occupied with the pasta. "You treated me like someone who was capable of making the best of a hard situation," she said carefully, "which is different. And also," she looked down at his hand over hers, "also, the thing turned out to be—" She glanced at Luca's back, the particular line of his shoulders. "The thing turned out to be its own thing." Her father looked at her for a long moment, then he looked at Luca. "Thank you," he said, "for what I can see you've done for her." Luca turned from the stove. He looked at Carmine Greco across the kitchen. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting us with the difficulty of it." It was an extraordinary sentence, she thought, for trusting us with the difficulty. Attributing to her father a generosity that was at least partially accurate, and that her father clearly needed to hear attributed to him, she filed it under. Luca Vitali is more socially sophisticated than his reputation suggests. Dinner was good. After her father left, she stood in the kitchen doing the dishes. She preferred doing dishes to using the dishwasher, a preference she'd brought from her apartment and never explained. And he stood next to her, drying, which he'd simply started doing one night, and continued. "That was kind," she said. "What you said to him." "It was true," he said. "He did trust us with it. He could have handled the DeLuca situation differently. He could have pulled the alliance at the first sign of threat. He didn't." "Because of me," she said. "Because of you," he agreed. She handed him a glass to dry. Their hands touched. She let them. "He thought it would be political," she said. "I think he thought it would be a cold alliance, a useful arrangement." She paused. "He didn't expect this." "Neither did I," Luca said. She looked at him. He was drying the glass with the careful attention he gave to small things, which was something she'd come to love, the way he brought the same quality of attention to ordinary tasks as to large ones, as though scale was irrelevant to the standard. "What did you expect?" she asked. "Functional," he said. "At best." He set the glass down. "I expected functional, and I got—" He turned to look at her. The expression on his face was the unclosed one, the one he'd been wearing more consistently since Positano, the one that showed the whole composition. "I got you," he said, which is the correct word, and also entirely inadequate. She set down the dish she was holding. She turned and put her arms around him, which she could do now, without the self-conscious calculation of the early months, with the ease of a woman who had been choosing this daily long enough that the choosing had become natural, and he held her back with the specific certainty of someone who was very sure about where he was standing. They stood in the kitchen. The city was outside doing what the city did. The life was inside. She was at the Harlem office on a Thursday in May. The new Brooklyn site was 2 weeks from opening. The orchestra ensemble program had its first performance scheduled for June. And she had spent the morning watching 23 teenagers rehearse a string arrangement of a modern song, with the particular fierce concentration that young musicians brought to things they wanted badly enough, when her director of operations appeared in the doorway of the glass-walled room where she'd been watching. "There's someone in the lobby," Maya said, "asking for you, no appointment." "Who?" "Says her name is Eleanor Marchetti." The name registered. She kept her face neutral, which was a practiced skill. "Send her in." Eleanor Marchetti was 32, dark-haired with an artist's quality of observation. She took in the room, took in Valentina, and Valentina saw immediately that this was not a woman who had come to perform conflict. She had come to say something, which was a different thing entirely. "I know who you are," Elena said, standing in the doorway of the office. "I know this is unconventional." "Sit down," Valentina said. She sat. Valentina sat across from her, the way she sat across from anyone she needed to understand. "I heard the DeLuca situation was resolved," Elena said. "Mutual friends." She paused. I needed you to know that he's a good man. Luca." She looked at Valentina directly. "I know that's a strange thing to come and say, but the way he ended things, he was protecting me. It was the most honest thing anyone has ever done for me, and I didn't understand it at the time." She stopped. "I wanted you to know, because you're living in it now, that the care he showed, it's real. It's all the way real." Valentina was quiet for a long moment. "How did you know where to find me?" she asked. "The foundation is public record." "Right." Elena looked at her. "Are you angry?" "No," Valentina said, and it was true. She considered why. "I think I'm—" She paused. "I'm glad he was capable of it before. It means what I'm receiving isn't something he invented for me. It's something he actually has." Elena nodded. Something settled in her expression. "That's what I wanted you to know." She stood. "I won't come here again. I don't need anything. I just—" She stopped. "I wanted to do one good thing with what happened." She left. Valentina sat in the office for a long time after, looking at the room where 23 teenagers had been practicing string arrangements, thinking about the specific strange landscape of being loved by someone who had loved before and carried it intact and offered it entirely. She called him. He answered on the second ring. "Something wrong?" "No," she said. "Nothing's wrong." She paused. Elena came to the office. Silence. Long, careful silence. "What did she say?" he asked, and she could hear the cost of the question. "That you're a good man," Valentina said, "that the care you showed her was real. She came to tell me it was real." Another silence. "I'm sorry," he started. "Don't apologize," she said. "She was right, I already knew. She just—" Valentina looked at the glass wall, at the empty rehearsal room. "She did you justice. I wanted you to know someone did." She heard him breathe. "Come home early," he said. Not a request. Not quite. Something that needed her presence. "I'll be there by 6, she said. She was there by 5:45. He was in the living room, standing at the window the way she'd stood at windows in all the beginning of this, looking out at the city. He turned when she came in. She crossed the room to him. He met her halfway. "She did you justice," she said again, quietly, because it was worth saying twice. He put his forehead against hers, which was something new, something he'd only started doing in the last weeks, the closest he came to simple surrender, the posture of someone who needed the specific contact of that particular closeness. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. She smiled. He could feel it against his skin. "I love you too. Still. Continuously. Continuously." he repeated. It doesn't stop, she said. That's the part I didn't expect. He made a sound that was fully and completely a laugh, the one she'd heard only a handful of times and kept like something rare. She pulled back to see it, to see his face open like that, entirely and without cost, the man underneath the structure. What? She demanded, smiling. You, he said. Just you. He touched her face. You are the thing I didn't expect. Outside, the May evening was settling into the city gently, the long light of a season that was beginning, warm, and without urgency, the kind of evening that remembered nothing of winter. She stood in it with him. She stood in it entirely. January came again. A year since the ceremony in Bay Ridge, a year since she'd walked down an aisle in a column of silk and looked at a sealed man at the altar, and understood that she was at the beginning of something, though not the beginning she expected. She had kept her condition, the year clause, the exit provision. She had kept it because she'd demanded it and demanded things were kept, not because she'd needed it. She had never needed it. The anniversary arrived on a Saturday. He'd told her 3 weeks in advance that he had something planned for the day, which she had noted with affection. He was still keeping the condition she had set about prior discussion, still applying it to circumstances that no longer required it as a condition, now just as a courtesy he'd internalized. She hadn't told him what she wanted to give him. She'd been planning it for a month. In the morning, she brought him coffee, where he was sitting in the east-facing study. Her study, the one he'd given her, the one with the morning light, and found him at her desk. He looked up, slightly startled. I was looking at this, he said. On the desk was a program from the first orchestra performance in June, the Greco Foundation Youth Ensemble's inaugural concert. He'd attended, had sat in the 4th row of a community center in Harlem, and watched 23 teenagers perform with a quality of attention she'd photographed him at from 3 rows back. She'd had the photograph framed. I wanted to be part of it, he said. I know it's yours. I know the foundation is yours, but I wanted to. He stopped. You are part of it, she said. She sat on the edge of the desk. It's yours too. You've been protecting it since October. She paused. I want you to join the board. He looked at her. Not as the Vitali name, she said. As yourself. As the person who shows up to watch teenagers practice strings and keeps pasta warm when I'm late from board meetings. She held his gaze. The foundation could use someone with your financial intelligence, and I want... She stopped. Started again. I want you inside my work, not adjacent to it. He was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said. She smiled. Later, in the afternoon, he drove her to a place she'd never been, a building in a neighborhood she knew by geography, but not by its interior, a renovated space in East Williamsburg that turned out to be a recording studio. I have it for the afternoon, he said. I thought he was uncharacteristically careful, which meant this was something he'd thought about significantly. I know you said you never practiced enough to be good, but I thought maybe... There was a piano in the studio, a beautiful upright, professionally tuned. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at him. You did this because of what I told you about my mother, she said. Yes, he said simply. She crossed to the piano and sat down. She put her hands on the keys, the same gesture she'd described to him months ago, the 3 hours after her mother died. but different now, full instead of hollow. She played, imperfectly, with the rustiness of 10 years of not practicing, with wrong notes in the places she'd always gotten wrong. She played a piece her mother had taught her, a Chopin nocturne she'd half memorized at 15, and she played it badly and beautifully, and he sat on a chair near the wall and listened with the quality of attention he gave to everything, entire, still, present. She played until the tears on her face were dry, which she hadn't been aware of until they were gone. She sat with her hands on the keys. She said, "She would have liked you." He said, "Tell me about her." So she did. For an hour, in a recording studio in East Williamsburg on their first anniversary, she told him about her mother, the piano, the garden, the laugh that was too loud for the room she was in, the way she'd loved Carmine Greco, with a full and fearless clarity that Valentina had only recently begun to understand as a model worth emulating. She told him all of it. He listened to all of it. Afterward, walking out into the January evening, the same January that had started all of this, one revolution of a year, she held his arm and he held her hand, and the city was cold and brilliant, and entirely unaware of the specific significance of the two people moving through it. "I want to stay married to you," she said. He looked down at her. "Is this the clause?" "The year clause," she confirmed. "This is me not using it." "I know," he said. "I wanted to say it out loud," she said. "I wanted to choose it out loud." He stopped walking. She stopped with him. On the January sidewalk, in the cold, early dark of a city that never stopped moving, he took her face in both hands, the gesture from the altar, the gesture from the window, the gesture that had become the physical signature of what they were, and looked at her. "I choose this," he said. "I know," she said. "I want you to hear it," he said, plainly. "Not the version I said before when I was still learning the language." He paused. "I love you. I would choose you in any arrangement or in none. I would choose you if there were no families, no treaty, no architecture that made any of this make sense. I would choose you because of who you are and who I become in the same room with you." He held her face. "That is the truth of it." She held the truth of it. It was a specific and extraordinary weight. She held it with both hands. She kissed him on the January sidewalk. He kissed her back. The city moved around them without pausing, as cities do, as the world does, as everything that is not the specific, singular, irreplaceable fact of two people who found something true in an arranged darkness does. They stood there. They chose it. Spring arrived the way spring always arrived in New York, in fits and starts, teasing warmth and retreating back to cold, then finally, decisively, committing. One day in early April, the city remembered how to be beautiful in the forward-looking way, and the park below the penthouse window turned green overnight in the manner of things that have been waiting only for permission. Valentina stood at that window in the early morning with her coffee, watching the green arrive, and thought about how many mornings she had stood at this particular window in the year and a half since she'd moved in. All the versions of herself that had occupied this spot, the contained, strategic woman of the first months, the woman learning to trust, the woman in love and refusing to fully name it, the woman who had named it in a kitchen with pasta cooling on a plate, the woman she was now, which was all of those and something more. She heard him behind her before he appeared, his particular step, the quiet of a man who moved through space with consideration. It's green, she said without turning. Spring, he agreed, coming to stand beside her, coffee of his own. They stood together at the window and looked at the park. I have the Brooklyn opening next Thursday, she said. I want you there. I'll be there. The board meeting is the week after. You'll need to review the Q1 financials before. I've already reviewed them. She looked at him. He was looking at the park with an expression of quiet satisfaction that she recognized as the face of a man who had found something to organize his love around. Not just her, but the things she built, the things she cared about. He had become, in the past 6 months, genuinely passionate about arts education in a way that she suspected had surprised him as much as it had moved her. He had spent 3 hours last month arguing with a city housing commission on behalf of the foundation's access to a rehearsal space, and she had watched him from across the room and thought, this is what someone looks like when they're giving their care to something. You argued with the Housing Commission for 3 hours, she said. They were wrong. They eventually agreed with you. They were wrong, he repeated. She could see the ghost of the smile. She laughed softly. She turned from the window and put her arm through his, leaning against him. Easy, completely easy, the body knowledge of a person who had been learning someone's specific gravity for 1.5 years and now moved in it naturally. His arm closed around her. Tell me something, she said. What? Something true that I don't know yet. He considered this. He had become, over the months, better at this. Better at the voluntary disclosure of small interior things, the unsealing that she'd watched happen incrementally and never taken for granted. When I was 9, he said, I wanted to be an architect. She smiled against his shoulder. Seriously. I drew buildings constantly. My teacher told my father I had a talent for spatial reasoning. My father told him I'd be running the family business. He paused. I stopped drawing buildings. I started learning the other kind of structure. Do you regret it? He was quiet for a moment, genuinely considering. No, he said. I think I became what I was supposed to become. I just built different things than I expected. She thought about this. What have you built? This, he said simply. She looked up at him. He was looking down at her, the full look, nothing withheld, the whole composition present. This, she agreed. She turned back to the window. The park was green, and the morning was beginning its various obligations, and the city was performing its perpetual miracle of containing all of human experience simultaneously. Below it, in the hidden infrastructure of other economies, 2 families were at peace. Above it, in a penthouse on the 53rd floor, 2 people who had been arranged against the dark were standing in the light they'd made. She thought about the night her father had called her into his study, the photograph, the girl who had said no before she said yes, the conditions she'd set, the conditions he'd set, the strange and gradual architecture of 2 people learning each other's structural language. She thought about a wedding in January cold, about a kiss that had 3 seconds and a hand on the side of her face that had never stopped holding her in all the ways hands could hold. She thought about pasta kept warm in an oven and water set on a desk, and a piano played badly in a recording studio and someone who listened to all of it. She thought about being loved by a man who had learned it the hard way and offered it without reservation. She thought about standing at a window in a burgundy dress with her back to a room that was selling her, and about the man who had seen that photograph and decided she was worth protecting before he'd ever heard her voice. She thought about what it meant to be arranged in blood and born in love. She thought, I didn't choose the beginning. I chose everything else, she thought. That is enough. That is more than enough. Luca pressed his lips to her temple, unhurried. She closed her eyes for a moment in the warm fact of it. The park spread green below them. The morning continued its ordinary, extraordinary work. Everything was exactly as it was. Everything was completely, fully, finally theirs. The peace held. The Greco-Vitale alliance became the most stable power structure in New York's history, noted by subsequent generations not for its violence, but for what it built. The Greco Foundation's 5 sites in 4 boroughs, the youth music programs that sent 11 students to conservatories in the following decade, the arts facility in East Williamsburg that bore no family name. Carmine Greco walked his daughter to the piano performance in Harlem on a Thursday in June and wept, which he denied to everyone. Nico Vitale was the first to notice and the last to mention it, which was typical. Salvatore Vitale, who had spent 60 years believing that peace was a temporary condition between necessary violences, sat in the 4th row of a community center on 125th Street and watched 23 teenagers play strings for an audience that included his son and daughter-in-law, and reconsidered. Luca Vitale joined the Greco Foundation board in January and argued with a housing commission in March and reviewed Q1 financials in April, and sat at a kitchen table every evening he was able and was, by every account, a man who had found the thing he'd been told he couldn't have. Valentina Vitale ran the foundation. She expanded it. She played the Chopin Nocturne, still imperfectly, still beautifully, on the anniversary of her mother's death every year, and her husband listened every time. She chose it every day. It chose her back.